quick welcome back to the next section of MGD, Main Gate Darbar. Diana is going to be hosting Amit today, and Amit's also been a big senior inspiration of mine. And so he's been doing some really crazy work. So today it's again, the format is informal, it's going to be storytelling, and Diana is going to be trying and dragging him so we can get the best out of him. So I'm going to hand it over to Diana. Diana, you're going to be on the spotlight and you can introduce Gulu and then get going.
I mean, we all know Gulu. So I'm not going to call him Amit because I get confused in who I'm talking about. So I will continue to call him Gulu. Now, I just want to kind of do a bit of a flashback and kind of go back to where I actually had my first kind of proper interaction with Gulu, where he was 4 years my senior, and I was sent to Gulu by Ranjan during my design process. He said, "Oh, you go and have a chat with Gulu and see what he thinks, and he's the guy." So I went and I obviously explained my project or not, and Gulu just went on to this sketching marathon. Means he spoke and he drew and he drew and he drew. And I'm like, what is this guy? Like, what, how is he doing this? So I was, totally kind of awestruck and, impressed. Let's put it that way. I was still in my foundation year. I wouldn't say I'm still impressed, but no, good. But I think since then, I mean, Gulu's still on speed dial when it comes to when I need to kind of get clarity and brainstorm about something. And even not just for me, but even my family, they'll say things like, "Apro Gullu no so advice che." So it's a funny reach out to guy. And I think what really goes down to is this incredible credibility that he kind of brings to the table. At least we all feel like that. Now, hopefully today we'll get to kind of navigate through how he's built that sort of credibility perception of him. So we start with this thing of how he landed up in NID and his backstory a bit. And I have been quizzing him quite a bit before these sessions anyway. So there has been a lot of back and forth. We've been picking each other's head, saying, "Okay, what do you think about this?" and all. So some of it was a bit of a tangent, but we have a fair questionnaire kind of thing put in place. So Gulu, tell us a bit of a background story, and then I'll quiz you as we get along.
Okay, thanks, Dee. That was a wonderful introduction. Hope I'm still credible.
Credible.
Over time, your credibility erodes, isn't it? Anyway. So thanks, Dee. I think NID was a real flash in the pan for me because, when you're in class 12th, you're pretty much trying to apply everywhere. I was reasonably good at the studies that happened in school, but, when entrance exams popped up, it wasn't my cup of tea. So interestingly, I think of all the places that I applied, I think the only place I got admitted to was NID. And I often do this what if scenario that if I hadn't got into NID, where would I have been? So it's always a nice thought experiment to do that. I think like most of the people in the late 80s and early 90s, NID was not a very well-known place. And it was basically because we had some relatives in Ahmedabad and my mother knew about it, that this option came up. And essentially the entrance exam that we had at that point in time was great fun. It was all about drawing. You were given little stickies of color to make things. It was just really different from what I was prepping for, things like the IIT exams and so on. So I think the signal that you got from the entrance exam itself was a really nice one, that it's a very lateral kind of place. And I still remember one question they'd asked, that what does your rubber slipper look like when you buy it? And when it's 2 months old, when it's 6 months old, and what is its condition when you actually throw it away? It just blew my mind, that question. And I still remember that the last frame I drew was, I think, somebody chasing a dog with it. He's actually trying to sort of, and I think the dog runs away with it. So sort of serves that person right, something like that. And I think the whole format was very interesting, and it was just really a great stroke of luck that I got in, and I think after that things went really well.
So you want to show us some cute pictures of how you grew up and stuff like that?
Yeah, of course. So should I just run through the deck, or should we do the conversation first?
I mean, I think so.
Can you see the screen?
Yeah, all photos will look the same, Vaibhav. All photos will look the same. He's never aged.
Okay, I'll put an end to that controversy. So a little bit about my childhood. So I was actually born in Lucknow, but I spent my childhood in Gujarat. So in my life, there have been many circles, keep coming back to the same place. So I spent my early childhood in Baroda, and my parents are in the first picture. And my dad's an engineer, and my mom teaches. And of course, those days she wasn't teaching, she was doing lots of other interesting things. But I think the foundation for doing things with my hands and not getting into a regular kind of road track, which a lot of us often get pushed into, was from the background that I had, that things were always fixed at home. My dad still thinks that nothing should be done by anybody else, because if there's an engineer in the house, that person better know how to fix everything. So I think even in the pandemic, he's been basically fixing everything, sometimes fixing them twice. So that's my childhood in Baroda. It was quite a fun childhood. That's my little brother on the tricycle. And I think from that age itself, there was a lot of fascination around wheels and movement. And, like all boys, actually, cars, planes, anything that moves was something that caught my fancy. And that kind of stayed with me. And my mom kept making sure that I, channelize my hyperactivity into some kind of art. So that's probably the first prize I won at art competition. It wasn't the first prize, but it was a prize. So, you can see that the first thing I could draw was just aircraft and parachutes and jets and things like that. So, it was a very early stage kind of obsession. And as I grew, the obsession kept on sort of expanding. So these little scribbles are things that my mom has cut out from my school book. So obviously I wasn't doing any studies, and basically the whole book was filled with things like this. And I think I was also very fascinated with my own signature, because they seem to be popping up everywhere. And I think Rahul Datta will like this little robot. I think I did this when I was in class 10th. I think Rahul is on the Zoom somewhere. I always think of him when I see this picture. So, from automotive stuff and aircraft and mechanical stuff, for a while, the whole obsession sort of went into birds and bird watching and things like that. And the sort of art instinct followed all these interests. And I think I was always given enough freedom and time to do all this. It wasn't really, something that studies were not really enforced. It was something you had to take a choice yourself. So that independence was there till the end, till the point I got into NID. And I think the only reason I got through was very few people must have applied because hardly anybody knew about it. So this is a picture which I think Sajid has taken. He's finally claimed ownership of this one because I've always wondered who's actually taken this. So this was the first, I think this was in second or third year, I think, right, Sajid?
Yeah, your third year.
So I'm not going to dwell too much about the actual projects, just take you through the whole journey. But NID was just like a completely fantastic place. And I realized also that a lot of the drawing and the work that I was doing in school was actually very, very substandard. Because when you get to NID, you see these gods of skills, people who are really, really good. And you realize that you have to unlearn and start from scratch. We were very fortunate. We had the best teachers. We had people like, Choksi, Naik. I mean, they really were very, very strong at making sure that you got the fundamentals. And they worked hard on all of us. And we had to also respond. Teachers like Dhimant. I mean, I can't thank all of these guys enough. I think all the skills that were honed to perfection, and you still felt that there was so much to do. I mean, this was all the great teachers that we had. I think we were very, very fortunate. So NID was like a giant playground for me. You did whatever you felt like. The workshops were free for all. You could get as much material as you wanted. I mean, there was absolutely no barrier to what you could do in the place. And I always tell, when I go back to NID, to the campus, I tell them that 90% of your learning is done outside your curriculum. When you're fooling around with stuff that you're not really supposed to do. So, there was a photo club in NID which was defunct. So I started mucking around with that. So I was self-taught as far as photography is concerned, but it was just because all the facilities were available to us. You could just walk in and take a camera, a very expensive camera. You could just pick it up and start walking around, figuring out how to use it. So I think that was the phenomenal part, that it was learning in a very diffused environment, learning with what your batchmates were doing. It was just amazing. And we had this little corner in the product design studio, and that used to be like a little hangout place. So I think the other fantastic thing was that there was no barrier between batches and ages, so you were eventually friends with everybody. And I think the whole main gate platform is a great example of that. I mean, we are across probably a decade. Probably I joined NID in 1990, and I know there are folks who are there from the year 2000 and beyond even, perhaps. So, that's the kind of bonding, that's the kind of brotherhood we had. It was just very, very strong. So these are just a few things that happened while we were in the studio. And this was the first time that a bunch of folks from NID tried to get featured in a magazine. And again, these are people, all the people in the picture are across batches, probably again 6-7 years. And we all sort of did stuff together and put it up. And not everything is done in a singular way, in the sense, not every thing that got printed was done by an individual. Very often we were helping each other. We were trying to figure it out together. There was nobody teaching us this stuff. We were just given enough time to do it ourselves. And then, of course, I think you were there when we were doing the conversation with MGD Nair, and with his intervention, I managed to do my training in Tata Motors. And that was also the time when Mugi, DNI, and Bose, we hung out quite a bit in Pune and got to know that place better. And that was a nice thing. I mean, there was no barrier in terms of how you could sort of move ahead with your conversations with the different groups talking together. It was very, very open. So this was just some of the stuff that I did in Tata Motors. A lot of it looks very dated now, but those days everything was done by hand. And then the other thing that we had at NID was a bit of insecurity. This was the time when there was no email, there was no internet, there were only magazines. And there was this constant insecurity that, are we good enough? Are we getting the right sort of skills? If we were to hypothetically go abroad or do anything else, are we fully equipped? because we did have this sense that we are in a kind of isolation because we weren't interacting so much with people from other places. So you're trying to constantly get into a competitive mode and trying to do things to pit yourself against other folks from different design schools, both in India and overseas, and try to see whether you can do better. So uh, interestingly, by the time I finished 5 years at NID, there was no concept of campus interviews those days. And a few people would kind of stroll onto the campus and, sort of talk to you and say if you're interested in a job. And I ended up meeting a few people in Bombay who basically needed somebody to help them with some special effects for advertising and things like that. So basically, for all practical purposes, I did not get a job. And my family was very supportive. They said that, why don't you try and do something on your own? So pretty much started in the backyard of our own apartment in Delhi and started, trying to speak to a few people. And the first few projects were very, very small, but they were fun to do because you got that sense of ownership that, everything that you're doing, you're going to have to handle it from start to end all by yourself. So I never had a job even for a single day. So the more you start doing things on your own, the more unemployable you get. So this whole idea of incubating ideas sort of came up in my mind. And this is just a snapshot of the sort of work we were doing in the early days. And what I've tried to do, and this is something Diana and I discussed, that, what are the skills that you need to keep strong throughout your sort of trajectory. And, being able to visualize quickly on the fly, sometimes in uh, collaboration with clients was something that came in very handy. So initial projects were all around appliances and basically doing the stuff we were trained to do. And unfortunately, this kind of work in India at that point, in the period between 1995, 96 to the early till 2000, in fact, it wasn't something that was going on a lot. There was not too much work around, and the work that was there was very, very it didn't pay a lot, and one didn't care about it because one didn't know what the benchmark was. So you got anything for your work, you were quite happy, and of course a lot of people didn't pay and so on. But this was an interesting project, in fact one of my first projects, which was actually to do an encyclopedia on Sikkim. And why I've kept it here is that it sort of, it was a bit like NID, it again took you outside your comfort zone. I spent about a month and a half in Sikkim, trekking all over the place myself, going to the tea gardens, the monasteries, and so on. So it was a very nice, sort of almost like a gap year kind of experience. And I ended up meeting a lot of interesting people and pretty much writing the whole encyclopedia myself. And this was on a CD-ROM format. The guys who actually, this is really funny, guys. So where was I? So anyway, we put this whole encyclopedia together, and basically the company that put this together went bust eventually. I don't even know where all the source code is, but I do have a lot of pictures. So I was given a budget to take as many photos as I could. So that was fantastic, walking around Sikkim with a jeep and then trekking through the forest and just taking photographs. And while we were doing some hardcore product design, we were also trying to do some UI UX kind of work. And I would say it was about equal, product design, UI UX, and eventually a little bit of space design work also came in. So these are projects which were done on the online platform when online was just scratching the surface. Now these health apps and all are very common. And we were working with startups, in the first dot-com boom, the period between 1999 and 2000. Most of these guys eventually went bust. And one of the things Dee and I were talking about is, how do you deal with a crisis? And, the sort of crisis that we are having now is, of course, a very protracted one. It's a very long one. But even at that point, a lot of our clients went bust. The Sikkim guys, the encyclopedia guys went bust. These guys went bust. Lot of unpaid bills, and basically the clients just disappeared and didn't pay us. And we were already very small, so we could have theoretically gone under. But like you say, banks are too big to fail. We were too small to fail. I mean, we were really, really small. And what we tried to do after that was trying to sort of build more scale in our work. And around this time, my brother who's an architect and my dad who's an engineer, we kind of teamed up, and that sort of synergized very well, and we were able to take on much larger projects. But interestingly, a lot of our work in the early days stayed on with startups. So companies like Barista, they were all startups when we kind of were working with them. And that was great fun, because you can do the most creative work with startups, because they don't have any preconceived notions. They're looking for the most disruptive ideas, and they don't mind working with young people. I mean, I was still about 24, 25 at that point, and they were very happy to work with us because they wanted fresh ideas. So what I've also tried to include are a lot of diverse projects, and you can see that the scale is kind of going up. This is an interesting story. My dad used to design industrial plants and do business plans for people making factories. But somebody saw my business card and it said industrial designer. So he thought that we design factories. And he landed up at our office and came up with this idea of doing a factory. And of course, he didn't want to do industrial design. He wanted us to design a factory. And it was a fairly large project, but that little misconception between designing an industry or designing a factory for an industry and industrial design sort of came in handy. So sometimes people not having enough understanding about design can also be helpful. So these are some happy accidents, and we got a great opportunity to design a new chain of hotels for the Taj group of hotels. So again, this was again a startup that was incubated by another larger company. So this kind of became a very common experience for us, young companies or completely new ideas being launched by established companies. And this was again, their vision was to be the world's lowest cost hotel. And this was in 2005, 2006. So it was quite ahead of its time. Recently, we did some work for Oyo, and what Ginger used to do in a decade, Oyo used to do in a month. So that whole idea of hyperscale has got completely redefined now. But interestingly, even when we were doing architectural projects, it was a very interesting synergy between the industrial design approach, very people-centric, very inside-out, and the architectural approach. So, this was a sort of intersection that we've been exploring ever since. That how do you apply different kinds of design methods to scales that you're not actually trained to work with. And of course, you need a team of people who understands that. You need engineers, you need architects, and so on. But the way we think about these problems, about these opportunities, is very three-dimensional. And that tactile aspect is still a very strong part of our work. So you will use computers, you'll use 3D CAD and all that. The essential starting point is still very, very tactile. It's very pen to paper kind of thinking. And of course, Ginger as a client has stayed with us for over a decade, almost 15 years now. And we must have done over 45 hotels for them over the years. So, we got that project because we had never done a hotel before. And they wanted a consultant who didn't have preconceived notions. But after we'd done a hotel, a lot of mainstream hotel guys came to us. And, this sort of large scale kind of project kept expanding. And, it went up all the way to a stadium and beyond. So we started getting more and more comfortable with scale, and the team that we have is also able to sort of deal with this sense of scale. And this is quite a well-known set of projects where Ayush also worked very closely with us. And interestingly, this project started off as a branding project. And they basically just wanted a bunch of graphics, which we also did. And they wanted us to kind of basically give an identity to all the spaces with a touch of an Indian element. But we kind of reinterpreted the brief. So it was very classic, design brief remodeling. That rather than doing exactly what the client is telling you to do, you're kind of redefining the brief and saying that, hey, we can go much more uh, sort of we can go beyond this brief and reinvent it for you. And this was again a project where we had multiple partners. We of course worked with Ayush on the mudras to make sure that they sort of get executed exactly how they were imagined in a very short period of time. We had another partner called Landau, which is a very well-known branding company, and they'd also worked with us on Ginger. So one of the other interesting features of how we work is to build very strong partnerships. And we're very agnostic to scale. I mean, we work on projects which are very diverse and of large and small scale. This is another project which Ayush and I worked on together. And again, the challenge was not just about creating a very opulent and India-inspired design in a different country, but the design challenge was also how to get it to the US. It was all made in Jaipur and taken to the US and assembled like Lego bricks. So there was a lot of design work that went into making it easy to disassemble and assemble and put it up in a very short period of time. And we've already had that discussion with Ayush. I mean, he was up to the challenge. And after these two projects, I think in between we've done quite a few other projects as well, and each one is a little more crazy than the other. And of course, more recently, we've kind of tried to reinvigorate the product design work as well. So, while we were working on larger scales, we weren't neglecting product design. It's just that it didn't scale up as fast. But interestingly, over the last couple of years, we've been able to, get this work back on track. And we've tried to move out of the styling domain to again work with a lot of people developing, new technologies like robots and new devices and so on. And there are quite a few partnerships with folks from NID and other specialists that we've built over the years. In fact, in a couple of these projects, we are working with Sandy as well. So a lot of partnerships.
Gulu, what is the timeline here? Are we talking, what year are we talking here?
This is maybe last 4 years.
Last 4 years. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And around this time, we also sort of realized that we need to make a slight shift in what we are doing to projects that can deliver more impact. And we always wanted to work in healthcare. I mean, do you remember even when you were doing your foundation design process, it was a medical product. And after we kind of left NID, we were constantly trying to find clients who could give us an opportunity to do a medical product or something to do with drug delivery and so on. And it was always the same chicken and egg. They would always say, have you done anything in medicine before? And the answer would be no, and we would never get to do it. But because we had a sort of, let's say, affinity for that sector, we started doing things like small clinics, we started doing eye hospitals, we started doing pharmacies. So we were not doing medical products, but we were working in the medical domain. And finally, we did get a chance from GE to actually work on a whole range of 4 products, in fact. And what they told us is that they liked the fact that we worked in hospitals and worked with doctors, and they wanted those insights. So they had never really worked with a company that had designed a hospital and also had the capability to design products that go into hospitals. So that kind of took, I would say, almost 15 years for us to get to a serious medical product. So, sometimes it's not so much about wanting to do something, but you have to consistently want to do that bad enough. It's a little bit what Sajid said, it's about having that vision out there. Have that picture in your mind that when that opportunity strikes, you're already ready to strike and move forward with that. So it took us a long time, but we had our eye on that ball that whenever possible, we should move into that. So this became quite an interesting set of projects that we did, and they won awards and so on. And what was the real contribution was also that they were super affordable. So we brought down the prices of these products using design thinking to almost 1/3 sometimes. So, you know, when in a medical product you bring the price down, the access becomes exponentially more. So that's something that was, quite strong feature of what we were able to do, that whole frugal design approach. And of course, we had done hospitals, we worked with Dr. Trehan, and I mean, we ended up doing a lot of healthcare spaces as well. So we're working on both ends of the spectrum. And this was another project that got a lot of visibility. It was actually something we didn't charge the government for. It was a pro bono project. And again, so if you want to create impact, sometimes you have to do pro bono work, because sometimes the most interesting work is being done by people who do not have a framework to pay a designer. But if you can intervene, it can have a big impact. So these are the mohalla clinics that are now, scaling up really fast in Delhi. And during the pandemic, they've had their own ups and downs. But essentially, they've been able to bring healthcare access to a very large part of the city, which earlier didn't have access to any kind of proper doctors. And it's also reduced cross infection in hospitals, because when people go to these places, they're usually very ill. And if they land up in a hospital, they'll end up infecting other people in the hospital, especially people who are more seriously unwell. So the last bit is just to sort of emphasize again the whole point of, uh, understanding while you are in design school, and of course later, what are your superpowers, and trying to maintain them, because you lose them. So I love teaching drawing. I love teaching, of course, a lot of other design subjects, but this is, I would say, my first love. And I try and maintain this skill, and do it whenever I have time. But I'm also showing you some pictures which have been taken in the last 4 months. These are projects that are going on right now. I can't give you too much detail about them, but I'm trying to show how these skills are being used during the lockdown process to communicate with the team. So, right now we have our teams working from home most of the time, or, working remotely. And sometimes the client is also in a different country, maybe. And you have to communicate on the fly. You can't even have the luxury of, saying, okay, I'll take a day and get back to you. You have to solve on the fly. And if you can do that, these are not perfect drawings, but it gives you the ability to visualize very quickly, and, what I call think on paper as you move along, and, speed up the process. So we never realized we'd be in a situation that we would need these skills in such a fundamental way, but it's really come in handy. And, all sorts of projects are going on right now, and it's become a very powerful tool for us to communicate with each other. So that's, I think, the last slide, and we can go back to your questions.
Gulu, we have a question which I know what the answer is, but I want you to see. Why is it called Incubus?
It's that first slide I put in. It's somewhere in the middle. It's about incubating ideas. That was the thought. See, remember the name Incubus came out in the first .com boom. So that time, this whole concept of incubators was very hot. So like these days you have startups. Those days you had incubators, people who sort of get people with ideas under one roof and say, okay, let's build something. So the vision was to do stuff like that. We never actually built our own incubator eventually. It needed a lot more money than we ever had. But we worked with people who needed ideas. So whether it was somebody starting a new retail venture, whether it was somebody starting a new .com, or whether it was somebody who was, whether it was an established company like a Unilever starting a new water business, or maybe Taj Group of Hotels starting a new hotel business, it was really incubating their ideas from start to end and really landing the plane for them. And of course, now you've got all these fancy words for it. So now it's called POC, proof of concept. And you've got something called a minimum viable product, an MVP. So you've got all this.
There's going to be posters made now now with all this?
So I'm saying all the jargon has come later, but this kind of work was being done as a part of that, I would say, mental picture we had created, that we'll incubate ideas for people.
I think, yeah, one of the, it's quite a big range that obviously we've seen, it's a whole spectrum, and in terms of scale and in terms of areas of work. Now,
Diana, sorry to
would you
interrupt.
say
Amit,
that
Amit, can you put off the screen share?
Yeah.
Unless you really like this drawing.
No, I can.
Oh wait, there is some
Yeah,
more.
this is the last slide. I just wanted to say that, a lot of the stuff that you see is not the work of one individual. I think that's another myth we like to break when we talk to our clients, that it's a team sport and everything that we do is done by groups of people. And when we collaborate, we don't just collaborate with external partners, we collaborate with our own teams. And we're not very worried about how old somebody is or how experienced they are. As long as they can contribute ideas, each idea has its own validity. There's no hierarchy when it comes to ideas. I think that's something we try and do a lot.
I guess that's also one of the ways you can keep your team inspired. So it's not like, they have to be of a certain, position in the company to contribute to
Yes,
ideas.
yes.
Cool. No, going back to my question was, of course, there's a range in the product, but what in the projects you've done, but what if I would ask you, what is it that makes you walk away from a project? I mean, what is it what are the criterias? And
interestingly, in between, we stopped saying no completely. We were so greedy, and we just wanted to do everything. And I think it's also a little bit about how maybe even I'm wired. I'm sometimes very distracted. Once I've done one kind of thing, we'll say, okay, let the team try and do something completely different, which is actually a little bit of a contradiction to how businesses actually need to be run. I mean, once you're good at something, maybe you should just do that and do a lot of that so that you can do it cheaper, faster, and in a more profitable way. Because we constantly keep getting distracted and moving to new areas, we have to start all over again and maybe learn at the client's expense, but also in many complex projects, learn at our own expense. So though it's great fun learning all the time, it can't be a sustainable business model beyond a point. So now we try and sort of balance some projects which are really the moonshots, and some which are probably a little more I would say predictable in the way they are executed, so that we are not constantly reinventing the wheel at our own cost. We've done a lot of that, and it's not the best way to operate a company, but in the pandemic situation, we've become even more selective because we've become a lot more, I would say, conscious about profitability and things like that. Because right now there's so little money coming around that we have to be even more careful about how we spend our time and money. When the going is good, lots of projects are making money, lots of projects are losing money. Maybe most projects are losing money. So, you're doing everything. You don't have time to monitor stuff. It's all very, very fluid. Right now, the work has reduced a little bit, so you're able to keep a much more sort of close eye on the numbers and be more careful about how you spend your time and money. So we become more selective now that the going is not so good. It's counterintuitive. I mean, right now we should be even more greedy, taking whatever comes our way, but we're not doing that.
No, but I think it also distills your skill sets, and like you said, you kind of zoom into what is it that is special about you and your team, and obviously what keeps your team going as well. So
yeah.
it has to, of course, it's your aspiration and what you want to do, but it also what excites the collective. So I mean, that's a huge challenge. How do you keep young teams kind of aligned and excited and motivated, which tell us some more about the team side of it, because that was a big team that we looked at in the slide before. Expo. So
Yeah, so again, the team is predominantly quite young, and of course, there are a lot of experienced people as well. And since the leadership is basically designers, architects, and engineers, we are able to constantly create frameworks for them to be cross-fertilized in terms of how they work. And we kind of often join the dots, but very often I think young people bring a lot of ideas on their own, and that also keeps us all very up to date with what the new kind of thinking is, what are the new tools that people use, what are the new technologies. In fact, again, to use the example of this crisis, like there's a saying that you should never let a good crisis go waste. So this is a very good example of that. I mean, we've seen a lot of people who were relatively inexperienced and younger coming up and doing all the tech stuff while we are working remotely and being very, very agile at that. So that's quite unusual, and I think we are now quite tuned to a lot of digital work practices simply because the younger people on the team are good at it.
no, also, we were joking about Superman wearing his, chaddi when the, going gets tough.
Yes.
So
Also outside his clothes. Don't
also
forget
outside
that. Because he wears it in a hurry, I guess.
So yeah, taking that analogy further, I mean,
Don't take
the
it very
whole-
far.
No, I think I mean, there are a lot of design challenges at the moment. Of course, there is remote working, etc., etc. There is not that much money in the market, etc. So, of course, tell us, the whole optimism of the whole time at the moment. What are your thoughts on the current situation? Because we briefly touched upon those things about all the different. Dot-com crash, the Lehman Brothers crash, and now, of course, the COVID struggle. So tell us the more optimistic side. So we all feel good.
I'm always reminded of what Ranjan used to say when we used to do design process. And he would always say that don't keep saying design is a problem solving process. He said you have to say it once, but don't keep saying it again and again, because when you repeat the word problem, it means you're doing something very pessimistic, because problem is a pessimistic term. So he would always say that after you've understood that the problem is on its way to being solved, keep using the word opportunity. And that's something that I've practiced quite a bit in everything. Whenever there's a problem, you can flip it and say, where's the opportunity in this? And I think that basic redefinition is something that shifts you from pessimism to optimism. And I think design has the power to be a very optimistic field. Even when everything is crashing around you, you can find something to fix. And I think that's something that, all of us try and do. And sometimes you don't have the ability to fix it. Let's be very frank about it. You can't fix everything. So you have to deal with the situation and do your best. It's as simple as that. And just keep at it. And, it's like keep calm and carry on sort of thing, but do it with optimism. And like I was saying, this is a situation where you really come down to your core skills. And that becomes very important as a survival tool. It's like when you're drowning, even if you don't know how to swim, you have no option but to swim. And if you don't do it, then you will definitely sink. So it's a situation like that, and one has to find where the closest shore is and try and swim towards that in whatever way you can. But I think while you're doing all this, one should not lose one's, humane sort of, let's say, humane aspect, because you can very easily forget that also. Because you're yourself stressed. So you have to keep reminding yourself that, you have to keep dialing back, because you can get agitated, you can be overworked and stressed in a situation like this. You have to keep dialing back and saying that, okay, how do I, bring the humanness back in this?
No, Gulu, I mean, obviously you've been a senior to a lot of us, and you've really inspired a lot of the younger kids. And of course, we know that you've been really influenced and impacted by Ranjan and other faculty. So other than faculty, who have been your seniors that have really influenced you and you kind of feel that, sort of,
So
yeah.
when we started the practice in 95, 96, um, I was very fortunate that one of my seniors came on board as a partner. I think everybody, most of you know Paldas. So we were a bit like yin and yang. I was more aggressive, inexperienced, and hard charging, and he was the more calm energy in the whole thing. And of course, then my dad and my brother also joined the practice over the years between 95 and 2000. But from a product design and design led thinking process, I mean, he was a great partner to have. Recently, about 3-4 years back, due to ill health, he kind of he's sort of decided to just not get too deeply into work in general. But I think that was a very fortunate thing to have somebody who's a little more experienced and also a more calm person around you. Because left to myself, I would be probably like a you know train on the loose sort of thing. At NID itself, I mean, we had some phenomenal people. I mean, in the PD studio, which was like a co-learning environment for all practical purposes, I mean, we had some really heavy-duty genius guys. We had, people like Michael Foley, we had Suhail, we had Santan. I think we were very blessed to have some really, really smart seniors. And I think it was not a competitive environment. It was like if they figured something out, they would make sure that all of us knew how to do it. So that was the beauty of the studio environment. Every time they cracked something or they found a new hack, all of us were told how to do it almost instantaneously. And it was again learning by doing. They would help us learn it. I remember Gary, who's actually doing furniture. He spent a lot of time just explaining how he used to ink the drawings. It's a very basic skill, but a lot of my lettering skills happened because he was able to do it very well. And that's also a very unexpected source, because typically we have all these tropes of design. Like a furniture design person will be a very rough and ready person, with a hammer and doing stuff with his hands, but not having the skill to do anything delicate. But Gary was a bit of both. He could do stuff with his hands, but he could also do the most fantastic drawings. So I think that was also a real learning, that you have to kind of be able to do pretty much everything that you're supposed to know as a designer, and nothing is optional. And and you have to just be like a sponge, just keep learning stuff from whoever's around.
So Gulu, obviously you learned a lot at NID. Tell us what you didn't learn.
Oh, that's a big regret that I have. I didn't spend enough time in the textile studio, so I can't weave.
Yeah.
Yeah, so linear materials, I think I had two really clumsy hands, and linear materials, I think, completely got skipped. And I think I realized much later how fundamental and important it is, because the whole economy runs on textiles. It's the largest employer, it's the largest export industry in many ways, handlooms and so on. It's often the largest, I would
Video. Somebody saying video. Did you?
intellectual
No,
capital. All the IP that is in the country is through textiles, because those are our sort of traditional knowledge systems. So that's one area that I think our teachers also didn't emphasize enough. They said if you're in product design, then textiles is something else. And I think there was a little bit of a mental hierarchy, if nothing else, at NIT, that textiles is about phool patti and a lot of drudgery on the loom, and product design guys are the jocks who are gonna fix the world with
donkey,
their
they're working
cars.
so hard. Say it, Gulu.
Yeah, so yeah, I was just figuring, I think a couple of years back, the highest paid designers from NID were in the textile stream. I think they were getting the most, I mean, if that is a metric, I can say that I think textiles is still
Yeah,
doing
textile.
yes. So
No, but
that's a regret.
I think what I was coming to is that, of course, there is a lot of navigation through different kind of projects, and there is been a multidisciplinary shift which came about from product design, architecture, etc. And I think somewhere that wanting that stimulus coming from various sources, so that not just you but also your team is stimulated and evolving. I think that has been how you've kind of navigated right through. And at the current juncture, it's the whole medical product thing which has come in the forefront, because it's suddenly become the key and the most relevant. Tell us a little bit more about when you're saying opportunity. Obviously now all intellectual capital is working from home, so it doesn't really matter if you're sitting in LA or you're sitting in London. How are you seeing that disruption impact that collaboration and teams coming together of just there is a new synergy that is coming about? What are your thoughts on that?
So there are three trends that I've seen over the last couple of years, and they've got accelerated during the pandemic. One was that if, as a designer, you have to um, have a base level of skill which is equivalent to anybody in the world. You can't say I'm in India, so I will not know certain things and I don't care about those things because they're not relevant to us. So we have to constantly reset that base level capability that we have to have. And a lot of it is thinking skills. It's not like being able to draw a straight line. It's intellectual skills. Once you achieve that, then it really doesn't matter where you are. Then geography is completely irrelevant. And there are people all over the world looking for the smartest people to solve their problems, and they can get to you really fast. And it's a myth that you need a website and the internet to do that. The most powerful thing for us is still word of mouth. Like if somebody refers you to somebody else, you don't even need to meet those guys because they already know that they can trust you. So we rely a lot on reputation and credibility, like you started off with, and make sure that that doesn't get eroded in any way. And that means taking a lot of personal ownership. Whenever you get in, and there will be situations where you'll have problems. You'll often end up doing something wrong. You'll often end up making a mistake. So you have to just stand up and say that, okay, we're going to fix it. So that optimism has to come in there as well. It's not just about just being foolishly optimistic. If you mess something up, you got to fix it. And you can say, yes, I can fix it and I know how to fix it and I'll at least try. I think people don't want you to be a Superman all the time, but they want you to be somebody who says yes and says, yes, I will try. Just saying I call it the power of saying yes. Yeah. Yes, I made
No problem, madam. No problem.
So sometimes you have to say no, and sometimes you have to proactively say yes. That's the other thing. And of course, I've already said that if your skills are strong, you can work remotely in a very powerful way. That's another very important thing. And people no longer care where you're from. If you can land the plane, they want the pilot.
Oh my God. Hello, note. No, I think, you did sort of touch upon this thing of, marketing tools and how, currently it's all about, how much press you've had as a design company, and which magazines you've been featured in, etc., etc. And I so totally agree with you where it comes to the where it is about that deliverable and the credibility. Where if your client is referring you to another person, that itself is this huge. It doesn't matter about what kind of social media exposure you have. I mean, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, how do you feel about you've consciously taken certain decisions when you've navigated through the whole marketing side of the business? What are your thoughts on that?
We have been a little complacent overall. We've said that, okay, word of mouth is what works for us, so let's stick to that. But I think beyond a point, you still need to be out there and visible, but in a very controlled way. And I think I can't give an answer for everybody, because every business has its own characteristics, and some need to be marketing driven, and some need to be awareness driven, and some need to be credibility driven. So we clearly fall into the third category, but it doesn't mean we have to neglect the other two, and we have traditionally neglected it, you know, because we're not very big, and we've been so focused on getting our clients satisfied and working on specific let's say design related issues, that we've forgotten the I would say we haven't given enough emphasis on the media marketing and awareness side, and I think we are going to be trying to remedy that in a few months. It's work in progress. We are very slow at it, we are very sluggish, but we have to change that. That's probably the only flip side. I mean, we really need to work hard on that.
And again, about I think for the younger generation, you know, when you are looking at talent, because I think, like you said, you're only as good as your team. So you know, you're constantly looking for that energy and synergy that kind of bring teams together. What is it that you're looking for? What's your kind of key thing that you really kind of tune into when you're actually recruiting or partnering or collaborating? I wouldn't just say recruiting, because I think now ways of working are quite different, but making your choices, what is it that you want to tune into?
So I think malleability is the first thing, that they're ready to learn and also align to what we are doing, but not lose what they come with. So malleability means you retain your properties, but you take a little bit of a twist. So that would be the first thing, because we are also looking for the teams who come in to bring something with them, which we don't already have. So that's important. The second aspect is that we don't always look for a lot of experience, because experience is sometimes a little overrated. You need experience in specific areas, but you don't need too many generals. You need a lot of people who can say, I'm going to pick it and do it all myself. So that hands-on capability to take it from start to end yourself, even if you haven't done it before, you're at least willing to try doing it. Because we also did it. No, when we started working, there was nobody telling us that, okay, this is the next step. We kind of muddled around and figured it out. So our role in that is to ensure that people can be given an environment where they can make some mistakes, or they have enough mentoring and watchfulness from the so-called experienced people to ensure that when they make a mistake, the more experienced people take the hit for that. They should say, oh, the weakest link in the chain did it, so it's not my problem.
Yeah, the passing the buck. I know that.
Yeah. So it's inverting the buck passing. It's saying that the senior most person is always accountable, not the junior most person. And by senior, I don't mean in years. I mean in terms of understanding about that specific situation. Sometimes the senior may be a younger person who knows more about something. So if somebody has to set up a Zoom link for me, I am the junior and the person doing it is the senior.
True.
And if I screw up, it's his problem.
True.
Because I don't know enough about it.
True. No, I mean, I know that we do have a lot of people who want to ask lots of questions and kind of get buzzing on that front. But I want to bring this, this thing on where, we have a silent person in this thing called Monica, who's a very dear friend of mine. And, she's been this back support, which you can say that, you see Gulu who thinks, yeah, I'm so cool, yeah. But there is a woman behind all that, this thing who I've known very dearly, and I take credit for, being a part of the whole sort of interaction, the social interaction between the two. Yes. But I want to bring it to this thing because we very often kind of forget that side of, you know, what level of family support we need to be able to deliver professional lives, which I think, you know, is the most important, I think, for us to be able to focus. So I'm just bringing that up. And of course, I have a whole lot of question marks that are popping up, but I'm not so clever to make a note of it. I hope somebody is making a note, because Mozi, I know that we can't put them on and stuff like that. So how do we take the questions? I'm quite happy to, you know, throw some questions at Gulu.
You already asked one, so I'll try and address that. So, you know, in any kind of entrepreneurial venture where the outcomes are not predictable, you know, you might draw a salary from the company, but like in the pandemic situation, it might disappear overnight, or it may be substantially reduced. But if you are in a job, then somebody else is taking care of that, and there is a cushion. And that's one aspect, that, you know, you're not in a very secure environment financially all the time. So if your ecosystem at home cannot deal with that, that can be a complete, I mean, your entrepreneurial venture will end right there. You know, you'll be told, just go and get a job, you know. So
stop talking so much, go and get a job.
Yeah. So I think there's always this, you know, element of not just risk, but catastrophic risk in any kind of entrepreneurial venture. And more so for people like me who have absolutely no job experience. You know, like I started off with, I'm unemployable. Nobody will ever give me a job, no matter how old I am. Because you cannot hire somebody like me, because I'll just mess up whatever I do. I can only run my ship. I can't run any other ship. Even my ship, there are lots of people helping me. So probably left to myself, I'll probably sink it. So I'm just saying that, you know, we are in a very self-created ecosystem at one level. And it's not easy. Whereas organizations are run on very different principles of predictability and structure and hierarchy and so on. So those are things that we don't fully understand. And we keep breaking them even in our system whenever we feel like it, because you're supposed to be a design thinker and you're supposed to break stuff once in a while. So I think it's not easy for somebody to be constantly dealing with that level of insecurity on so many fronts. And then, of course, any entrepreneurial venture is also extremely intense. You know, so you can't do this kind of design-led entrepreneurship without a lot of full intensity, you know, so that's also sometimes not easy to deal with. So I think you have to be blessed with a really super good ecosystem to be able to do what you do. And I'm sure people like Sajid and others who've done their own design ventures have a similar experience. I mean, in a different situation, and all entrepreneurs go through ups and downs. I mean, we've been through so many, and sometimes
Gulu, just before questions, no, Dahi has made some fun posters as his gift for you. So I'm just going to share screen. That's done by Daya, and it's a fun.
These are all inside jokes, so you'll have to explain them.
Yeah, so Gulu, go for it.
You explain them.
Gulu, what's the story about Jap?
Yeah, man, what is this?
Jap always had the I mean, he always knew more than you knew, right? So
that's true.
You cannot beat Jap on knowing it all. You can see it in his expression, right? So SPD is, for those who don't know, simple product design, and TCP is technically complex project. So if your SPD is TCP, then you're on a good wicket.
Okay. Next slide.
Yeah, this is the moonshot I was telling you about.
Gulu, go for it. What's the story here?
Yeah, I think I used to drip dry my clothes and wash them every day. So they were always clean, and I think they looked ironed. They weren't actually ironed.
Gulu, they were ironed, man.
He's always ironed. Gulu had a dry cleaner he brought with him from Delhi.
You're
one of the few people who had pinstripes before we left NID itself.
Before pinstripes were even born.
Yeah, before anybody knew about it.
Gullu, go for it. Your roommate.
He wasn't my roommate. He was my next door neighbor. Hey, can I have some? Oh man, these are scary. Yeah? We had to clean them all the time, and we had a special Rotring cleaning fluid to make sure that they work all the time. Now you can just buy one for $20 and throw it away when it stops working. Oh man, these were like a project.
I think that poster was also Daya's tribute, saying that, you know, because of you, we've all become sharp. Your language and you know, the words you've used, we used to write it down in notebooks and try and use it in our sentences.
Thank you. Oh, this was just a little sort of, I would say, eccentric habit, which I think Pratap and I picked up at some point. First, I think we figured that the Romans never had a U; they only had V. So we used to only use a V and never a U. So I don't know why we started doing it, but it was great fun. I still do it once in a while.
Yeah, so that's it for that, going off the share. And just for some questions.
Thank you, Daya. That's like fantastic stuff.
Givlati rocks.
Yeah, Givlati. So there is some
Not
questions.
on the rocks.
I think there were a few people who asked about what is the culture like at Incubus, or how do you maintain culture as an organization grows? That's something which happens at, you know, in a small team. It's very easy to keep culture, and the fear of a lot of people is as you grow, you lose that culture. So what do you do to retain culture in organization? How important is that for you?
It's very important. In fact, I've got a whole like 40-deck presentation only on culture. We can do it one day. But the distillate of culture is that in our case, we started off with a very strong culture because there were only 5 people in one 200 square feet room. And all of us were friends, or we had been, I mean, some of them were my students, and some of them had been with us since their first job. And of course, Paldas and I were there, my brother was there. So the culture in that 5-man team was very, what we call an implicit culture. Everybody knows what the culture is. You don't have to explain it to them because you've all kind of grown up in that situation together. And everybody has an interchangeable answer. So if there is a very important cultural issue, you know, like what to do if somebody is falling sick, or if somebody has to go home, how to help that person, there'll be only one answer. Everybody will agree on the answer, and it'll be the right answer for all of us, and it'll be the best thing one can do in the situation. So in our case, it went through a sine wave. Initially, the culture was strong because it was implicit. Then I think as it expands the team, you have to be told. Somebody has to tell you that look out for culture. Nobody told me that. So we kind of dropped the ball on that one, and it became a freewheeling culture. Every person created their own culture, and then over time there are lots of senior people in the company who create their own ecosystems. And sometimes it's very difficult to get rid of senior people who are a little toxic, even because, you know, they have a lot of value to add, but they do it in a way that is probably not compatible with the culture. But you know, if you fire that person, you will suddenly have a big hole in your revenue, or you won't, your organization will lose what you call institutional memory. You know, somebody who's been with you, say, for 10, 15 years has institutional memory. There's certain stuff that only that person knows. So that's the threat. But over the last 3-4 years, I've learned that whoever's the entrepreneur who was running the company has to be like 100% onto culture. Culture is more important than anything else. Whether it is business development, whether it is keeping your clients happy, all of that is secondary. Culture is paramount, and you have to be personally involved in driving that. If you don't drive the culture, nobody else will. They will take charge of it and they'll run you to the ground. And an organization without a culture is totally soulless. So we went through the sine wave. We had a high point in our culture because it was entrepreneurial, very close-knit, family-like. Then I kind of ignored it while the organization kept growing. And then we had certain problems which woke me up to the problem and said that, okay, it's something that cannot be ignored. It has to be fixed very, very fast, very proactively. And Now we are doing that and it's back on track. It's, I won't say it's 100% solved, but it's on the way to, at least I know what levers to pull to keep it on track. But you have to be personally involved. It is the most important thing in an organization.
I mean, just
And it
two more
nothing to
questions
do with
for
size.
want of time. There's one question, I think apparently must be somebody who's a junior, asks that when you go for a project, I think it applies to a lot of designers, that when you go into, say, an industry where they ask you, we need experience, and it's a chicken egg situation. Sometimes you want the project, and then to get the experience, you need the first project. So, for example, if you're in the medical thing, you've gone in or you worked in a hotel. So how do you counter that discussion when a client says that, do you have experience in that field, or somebody starting off new? How do you get that first project?
So, you know, this is a very important question. I'm asked this question all the time. Firstly, how do you say it? You have to, it's a trade-off. If you really want a project bad, somebody has to also be willing to risk you on it. So I think there's an element of self-selection in it. We get projects where we are inexperienced in that specific domain only because the client wants some other experience that we have to infuse into that. So I'll give you an example. When we did the first hotel project, they specifically wanted somebody who hadn't done a hotel before, because they didn't want all the legacy issues which hotels have to get replicated. And if you go to a specialist, they will do the same shit all over again. They will not think afresh. So only a smart client will say, I want somebody who hasn't done this before, but is willing to solve it on the fly. So there is self-selection. If you can find a client like that who's willing to risk his chips on you, then you've got the right kind of client. And you can't force somebody to do that. You can't arm twist anybody to give you a project. So if they want somebody experienced, they'll get a stereotypical solution. If they go to somebody who's willing to learn on the job and give them something very, very distinct, then they'll have to take a risk. So both of us take that risk, and the client has to be willing to say that, you know, if this thing fails, I don't mind, at least we tried our best. There are not too many guys like that. And typically startups have that mentality. And we've been very, very fortunate, I think, from our first project, to have a client who said that, you know, you guys haven't done it before, but I'm sure you'll figure it out. And we are still getting clients like that, and they stick with us. So
Then,
that's, I would say.
Last question, not that serious,
yeah.
is a lot of people are curious about your command of the language and that running thesaurus, which follows you like a little puppy dog. So how did that happen? I mean, how is that your whole command over the language? Is it from the books you read? Is it that you keep in touch with stuff? So how did that happen?
Okay, my mom teaches English, so I think I got a head start over there. And I always had a lot of books, so I was encouraged to read. So I'm like a sponge when it comes to books. Of course, last few years my reading has dropped very substantially, but under normal circumstances I do read a lot. So the best way to improve your vocabulary is just to read a lot.
Sure. Just before a vote of thanks, I'm going to spotlight Yankee so she can tell us the score for Diana.
No, this time even Gulu is saying you know, by the way.
That's
so,
because of you. Yankee, unmute and give us the update. What's the score?
Yeah. I know Gulu was also saying it, so I had to be very careful that it was only your number. Deep, I think Dhiraj, you and me were very close with, so it's 49.
Oh, almost 50. So Amit, you have to give hugs to Dhiraj and Yankee.
49. I was waiting for one more, but then you didn't speak again. So I was like, let us speak, you'll make the numbers.
I mean, I'm going to invite or spotlight another massive fan of yours who's been supremely influenced by you to give a vote of thanks. And please make sure you mention a big thank you to Diana also. And that's Abhijit from who's started off at Titan. Bansode will give a vote of thanks today.
So, yeah, you know, it's really amazing because NID, you hear about people first especially seniors, because somebody's already built a temple for you. In your case, Bose was my good friend and who built almost a temple. And every story about we I knew before I saw you, because I joined. I guess you would have moved out of NIT that
No,
time.
you were still around.
Yeah, maybe diploma project time or something. I don't know
Yeah.
what was that. So, and I really remember such specifics that of your work, and uh, in that right corner, you guys, your profound voice would come, and I said, "Wow, how much one can speak on design." One day when I grow up, I wish I could talk like this. Still not happened, but you truly inspire us on that.
Thank
I
you.
remember even a project or a discussion vague you had about, if you remove the bricks and only put the pipes, you can see the building structure. I think, I don't know whether it's true, whether Bose's myth, mythological stories or not. you know, so such wide details we know about people, and seeing work in NID, especially, all seniors who done that work. It looked impossible that, I'm going to learn all this at one day, But as you said, it's just being together, we've learned so much, and I guess after NIT I didn't interact much, but I think last 10 years, I think since
Yeah,
I
we've been
started my own
bumping
thing,
into
there are
each
many
other. Yeah.
opportunities to meet and talk. But it's really amazing, we always felt, I mean, how can a company grow to 50 people, 60 people, and it, as an entrepreneur, it always seems so amazing, and inspiring. So, I mean, truly thanks to not only, who you guys are, but, and for you, us to directly, indirectly influence in thinking, seeing things differently. It made a lot of difference to people like me, and I'm sure many of your juniors, around you. And I guess it's so amazing to see your journey and kind of scale and the work you're really doing that. I think it makes it worth of what we're trying today, and seeing that, hopefully collectively we make this even bigger. So Ginger has been a classic case, I mean, we get associated to that one project, and sort of defines and, we remember. Uh, yeah, I mean, thank you so much for inspiring us and sharing your
Thank
work
you so
today.
much.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Diana,
Anil.
last word for you, Diana, before we close.
And
Yeah.
Jean, thank you so much. Sorry, I am.
तू बहुत बोलता है, मेरे से ज्यादा बोलता है, ठीक है ना? Oh, by the way, I have to add to this. I mean, I can't hold it. When Gulu was saying, oh, culture, this thing, he told me, he gave me like a whole document about work from home culture that he actually worked with his team. He developed it with his team. And when I went through it, I was like, what is this guy? So talking about culture, not only when they come to work, but also when they're at home. Like there's a whole section which is called Be Your Best Self. And I mean, only Gulu can think like that. It's incredible. So my
You have to
very
just
dear
try.
friend.
Not everybody will be, but you can at least make an attempt.
Well, I'm trying, yeah.
Yeah, besides all
thank
this
you.
serious side, Gulu also has his major prankster side, which you guys don't know about. So I remember once Gulu had organized, and I think 50 of us at 3 a.m. went and knocked on Adarsh's door. And Adarsh opened the door, and there were 50 of us, and we asked him, what happened? What happened? And Adarsh was fully confused, like, there are 50 people who woke him up, asked him, what happened? Is everything okay? And he said, don't worry, guys. Thank you, man. I love you all. He went back to sleep. That's all Gulu's visualization. So thank you so much, Gulu. Thanks everybody for
Thank
being
you.
here at
Fantastic
but-
platform.
MGD. I'm going to
Paul, we do want to thank you as well, Moz, for enabling this. So
Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
so here's some